Hello everyone and welcome to Spill Secret. Before we start, we ask you subscribe and leave a comment as to where you are listening from. Let's begin. David Jensen hadn't wanted to work the graveyard shift. But after losing his last job and struggling to pay the bills, he couldn't afford to be picky. The job was at an old, small-town radio station that barely scraped by, tucked away on the edge of town where the streetlights faded and the world grew dark. His only company in the tiny booth was the low hum of the station's equipment, the occasional static on the airwaves, and the midnight calls from strangers with strange requests. He'd been working for 3 weeks when the first unusual call came in. It was just after midnight, and David was half asleep in his chair, leaning back with his feet propped up on the control panel, when the phone rang. Startled, he sat up, rubbing his eyes as he answered with the usual, "WMJS, the midnight show. You're on the air." There was a long pause, and then a voice, soft, almost a whisper, came through the line. "Are you alone?" The voice asked, low and hesitant, as though the caller were afraid of something lurking just out of sight. David frowned, glancing around the empty room, his own reflection staring back at him from the glass window. "Yeah, I am," he replied, trying to keep his tone light. "What's on your mind?" The voice hesitated before continuing, each word slow and deliberate. "You shouldn't be alone. Not tonight?" A chill ran down David's spine as he listened, the caller's tone so unsettlingly serious that it was impossible to laugh off. He forced a chuckle, trying to shake off the unease creeping into his bones. "Is that right? And why's that?" he asked, hoping for a punchline or a laugh, something to break the tension. But the caller didn't laugh. "It's watching you, David," the voice said, barely above a whisper. The line went dead, leaving only the hum of the equipment, and the faint static on the air. David sat there, staring at the phone, his mind racing. He'd received plenty of prank calls in his time, but something about this one felt different, more personal. The station was isolated, its windows open to the empty fields beyond, and the thought of being watched sent a shiver through him. He glanced around the room, his gaze drifting toward the window where his reflection stared back, a shadow in the dim light. For a moment, he thought he saw something, a flicker of movement in the glass, like a shape passing by in the dark. He shook his head, telling himself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, a figment of his imagination. But as the night wore on, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone, that the silence held something darker, something waiting just beyond his sight. The next night, David returned to the station, a lingering unease settling over him, as he unlocked the door and stepped into the quiet, dimly lit room. The caller's voice from the night before echoed in his mind, the words chillingly clear. He tried to shake it off, chalking it up to an overactive imagination, and the isolation of working the graveyard shift alone. But as he sat down and adjusted his headphones, he couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. The hours crept by in silence, punctuated only by the occasional static from the radio and the low hum of the equipment. He scanned the empty room, his eyes drifting to the shadowed corners as if he expected something to emerge from the darkness. The phone stayed silent, the quiet growing heavier with each passing minute, until he found himself longing for a call, any call, to break the tension. Just past 2 a.m., the phone finally rang, its sharp sound startling him. He picked it up, heart pounding, and answered with his usual line. "WMJS, the midnight show. You're on the air." This time, the voice on the other end was different, deeper, with a strange, hollow tone that seemed to vibrate through the line. "You didn't listen, David," the voice said, its words drawn out, laced with a mocking edge. "You stayed alone." David's grip tightened on the phone, his pulse racing. "Who is this?" he demanded, trying to keep his voice steady, but there was an edge of fear he couldn't hide. The voice chuckled, low and unsettling, a sound that seemed to echo through the room, filling the silence. "I'm closer than you think," it replied, the words slipping into a whisper that sent a chill down his spine. "Much closer." The line went dead, the silence pressing down on him like a weight. David sat there, the phone still clutched in his hand, his mind racing as he scanned the room, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. His eyes fell on the window, and he froze. There, just beyond the glass, he saw a faint outline, a shadowy figure standing in the dark, watching him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He blinked, and the figure was gone, leaving only the reflection of his own pale face staring back at him. He dropped the phone, his hands shaking, and tried to steady his breathing, telling himself it was a trick of the light, a momentary illusion. But as the night wore on, he felt the weight of the darkness around him, a presence he couldn't see but could sense lurking just beyond the reach of the dim lights. The hours dragged by in silence, each tick of the clock echoing through the empty room, until he began to wonder if he was losing his mind. But deep down, he knew the truth. Something was watching him, waiting in the shadows, and it wouldn't be long before it made itself known. David's hands still shook the next night as he entered the station. He could hardly believe he'd returned. His mind had spent the day turning over every detail of the strange calls, that chilling voice that had felt so close, and the figure he'd glimpsed just beyond the window. Each thought felt like a stone sinking deeper into his mind, weighing him down with dread. The urge to leave the job, to disappear, gnawed at him, but something darker, some unexplainable force, pulled him back. He settled in, his fingers fumbling over the controls as he began his shift. The minutes dragged, each tick of the clock magnified in the oppressive quiet of the studio. He kept glancing at the phone, half hoping it would stay silent, half dreading the inevitable ring that would break the silence. When it finally rang, the sound sliced through the air, making him jump. He picked it up with reluctance, his voice unsteady as he answered. "WMJS, the midnight show," he managed, trying to sound calm. There was a pause, and then a familiar, cold voice seeped through the line. "David," it whispered, drawing out his name in a way that made his skin crawl. "Still alone?" The voice was almost playful, but there was a malevolence beneath it, a darkness that felt as though it were reaching out through the line, clawing at him. David swallowed hard, his throat dry. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The silence stretched, and he could hear the faint crackle of static on the line, as though something was shifting, waiting. Finally, the voice replied, its tone dripping with sinister amusement. "I want you to listen, David. I want you to hear what's coming." The line went silent, and he held his breath, waiting, straining to catch any sound. But there was only silence, thick and heavy, pressing down on him, filling the room with an unbearable tension. Just as he was about to hang up, a faint, distant sound broke through the silence, a soft scratching, barely audible, but unmistakably real. It grew louder, echoing through the line, each scratch dragging slowly, methodically, as though something were clawing its way toward him. His heart pounded, the sound filling his ears, drowning out every rational thought. He wanted to hang up, to throw the phone across the room, but he couldn't move, trapped by the horror unfolding through the receiver. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the darkness. "Look behind you, David," the voice said, the words slipping into his mind like poison, freezing him in place. He didn't want to turn around, every instinct screamed at him to stay still, to keep his eyes fixed on the safety of the studio walls. But the pull was too strong, the dread too thick. Slowly, heart racing, he turned. In the dim reflection of the window, he saw it, a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room, its eyes glinting with a faint, malevolent light. His breath caught as he watched it shift, taking a step closer, its outline blurring as though it were slipping between worlds. His mind reeled, every nerve screaming in terror, but he couldn't move, couldn't tear his gaze away. And in that frozen moment, he knew with chilling certainty, he was no longer alone. David sat frozen, his breath shallow, staring at the shadowed figure in the reflection of the window. It was closer now, its form barely distinguishable in the dim light, yet somehow unmistakably human. The silence in the room was thick and suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the equipment and his own racing heartbeat. He tried to speak, to shout, to demand the figure leave, but the words stuck in his throat, caught in the grip of his fear. The figure took another step, its dark shape shifting, blurring, as though it were slipping in and out of existence. David could feel its eyes on him, a cold, piercing gaze that seemed to see straight through him. His hand gripped the edge of the desk, fingers digging into the wood as he tried to keep himself steady. And then, as if sensing his growing terror, the figure stopped, its form melting into the shadows, leaving only silence in its wake. David exhaled, barely realizing he'd been holding his breath. He glanced around the room, his gaze darting from corner to corner, searching for any sign of the figure. But the studio was empty, as silent and lifeless as it had been before. He almost convinced himself it had all been a trick of the light, a product of his overworked mind. But deep down, he knew the truth, something was here, lurking in the shadows waiting. The phone rang, jarring him from his thoughts. He reached for it, his hand trembling, and lifted the receiver, bracing himself for whatever horror lay on the other end. "WMJS, the midnight show," he whispered, barely able to keep his voice steady. The line crackled, a low, distorted sound filling the silence, and then the familiar voice returned, soft and mocking. "You didn't listen, David," it said, a hint of amusement lacing its words. "I told you. You're not alone." The voice faded, replaced by a faint, rhythmic tapping, as though someone were knocking on a door somewhere deep within the building. David's blood ran cold as he listened, his mind racing with horror. The sound was coming from behind him. He turned slowly, heart pounding, his gaze fixed on the door that led to the empty hallway. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, each knock echoing through the silence like a heartbeat. He wanted to run, to leave the station and never look back, but something held him in place, a dark, inexplicable pull that kept him rooted to the spot. He took a step forward, his legs trembling as he moved toward the door, his hand reaching out to grasp the handle. With a deep breath, he opened the door, his eyes peering into the shadowed hallway beyond. The tapping stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to stretch on forever. He stepped into the hall, the walls pressing in around him as he moved forward, each step taking him deeper into the darkness. The faint sound of whispering drifted through the air, a haunting melody that filled his mind, twisting his thoughts into knots of fear and confusion. And as he walked, he realized with chilling certainty that he was no longer walking alone. Emma McConnell had never been the type to believe in ghosts. A practical woman in her late 20s, she had moved to the city for a fresh start after a difficult breakup, and the last thing she wanted was to be distracted by old wives' tales. The apartment she'd found was cozy enough, nestled in an older building with classic brick walls and large windows that let in just the right amount of light. Sure, the building was a little run down, with the occasional creak and groan from old pipes, but it had character. Besides, the rent was reasonable, a rare find in a neighborhood like this. Her apartment was on the second floor, a quaint little one-bedroom unit that felt like her own personal haven. However, she quickly noticed something strange about the third floor, particularly apartment 3B. No one ever seemed to come in or out, and whenever she passed by, she'd get an inexplicable chill, like a gust of icy wind sweeping through the hallway. She chalked it up to the drafty old building and thought nothing more of it. One evening, after a long day at work, she was returning to her apartment when she heard something unusual. The hallway was silent, but as she approached the stairs leading to the third floor, she heard faint whispers. She paused, straining to hear, but the whispers faded as soon as she focused on them. Curious, she made her way up the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The door to apartment 3B was slightly ajar, and a faint glow seeped from the room, casting eerie shadows on the walls. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the door. Logic told her to turn back, that it was none of her business, but an inexplicable pull drew her forward. She nudged the door open, her heart pounding, half expecting someone to yell at her for intruding. But the apartment was empty, silent except for the faint rustling of papers on a table by the window. The place looked abandoned, with a thick layer of dust covering everything. The air was thick with a stale, musty odor, as though it hadn't been lived in for years. Emma stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the dusty windows. The room felt heavy, oppressive, as though an invisible weight hung in the air. She glanced around, noticing that the walls were covered in old photographs, their colors faded, each frame slightly askew. Most of the photos were of a young woman with dark, haunting eyes, her expression vacant and distant, as though she were looking through the camera rather than at it. The woman's presence was unsettling, her gaze seeming to follow Emma as she moved through the room. A cold draft swept through the apartment, and the door slammed shut behind her, making her jump. She turned, her heart racing, but there was no one there. The silence felt thicker now, pressing in on her from all sides. She tried to shake off the unease, telling herself she was just tired, that she'd imagined the whispers. But as she moved toward the door, she caught sight of a mirror on the wall, and in it, the reflection of the woman in the photographs, standing right behind her, her dark eyes locked onto Emma's. Emma stumbled back, her heart hammering as she stared at the mirror. The woman's reflection remained for just a second longer, then faded like mist, leaving only Emma's own wide-eyed expression staring back at her. She backed away, her hands shaking as she fumbled for the door handle, desperate to escape the suffocating atmosphere of apartment 3B. Just as she pulled the door open, a whisper drifted through the room, soft and barely audible, but unmistakably calling her name. Emma. She didn't look back. She bolted down the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway, her mind racing. By the time she reached her apartment, she was out of breath, her heart still pounding from the encounter. She locked the door behind her, leaning against it, as she tried to steady herself. She wanted to believe it was her imagination, that the long day and the eeriness of the old building had played tricks on her mind. But deep down, she knew what she had seen. The woman's image had been real, solid enough to send chills down her spine. The next few days passed uneventfully, and she managed to convince herself that the incident had been a figment of her imagination. But every time she passed by apartment 3B, she felt the same cold, foreboding chill sweep over her. The door was always closed now, but she could swear she heard faint whispers emanating from within, like someone murmuring secrets in the dead of night. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just the old pipes, the sounds of a creaky building settling with age. One night, she was lying in bed, just on the edge of sleep, when a loud thud echoed from the apartment above her. She jolted awake, her heart pounding as she listened. Another thud followed, this one louder, like something heavy being dropped on the floor. She tried to ignore it, But then the whispering began again, drifting through her ceiling, faint and haunting. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was pleading, filled with a desperation that made her skin crawl. Unable to bear it any longer, she got out of bed, grabbed her flashlight, and made her way up to the 3rd floor. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from her flashlight as she approached apartment 3B. She pressed her ear to the door, her pulse quickening as she listened. The whispering had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to vibrate through the walls. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob, but before she could decide whether to open it, the door creaked open on its own. Inside, the apartment was as she remembered it, dusty, abandoned, with the same stale odor hanging in the air. But this time, there was something different. The photographs on the wall were gone, replaced by torn scraps of paper and what looked like scribbled notes, scattered across the floor. She picked up one of the papers, her heart sinking as she read the words scrawled in messy handwriting, "Help me. She won't let me leave." A cold chill settled over her as she scanned the rest of the room, noticing more notes scattered around, each one a desperate plea for help. The woman's face appeared in her mind again, her dark eyes filled with an emptiness that seemed to reach out to Emma, pulling her into a place of despair. She turned to leave, but the door suddenly slammed shut, the sound echoing through the empty apartment. The whispering returned, louder now, filling the room with a haunting melody that wrapped around her, tightening like a noose. Frozen in place, Emma felt the air grow colder, a freezing breath grazing the back of her neck. She didn't dare turn around, but the reflection in the mirror caught her eye once more. The woman was standing right behind her, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow. And this time, the woman's lips moved, forming a single word that chilled Emma to the bone: "Stay?" Emma's mind screamed for her to run, but her body was rooted in place, trapped by the chilling presence behind her. She watched, horrified, as the reflection in the mirror twisted. The woman's face shifted, her dark eyes filling with an intense sorrow, as if pleading with Emma for something beyond words. Emma closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing, forcing herself to gather the courage to move. She whispered under her breath, "This isn't real. It's just my mind playing tricks." But the whisper that answered her shattered any remaining doubt. "It is real, Emma?" The woman's voice was soft, almost gentle, but it held a desperation that made Emma's skin crawl. She opened her eyes, finding herself alone again, the reflection gone. Without looking back, she bolted for the door, throwing it open and stumbling down the stairs, the lingering chill following her like a shadow. Back in her apartment, she locked the door, her heart pounding. She knew she couldn't keep running from this. Whatever haunted apartment 3B wouldn't let her go so easily. The woman's face haunted her thoughts, those hollow eyes staring right into her own. Who was she? What did she want? And why did her spirit linger, trapped in that dark, empty apartment? Questions flooded her mind, each one more unsettling than the last. Determined to find answers, Emma returned to the library the next day. She scoured the town records, searching for anything related to apartment 3B, but found nothing beyond ordinary records of residents. It wasn't until she came across an old article in the archives that she uncovered the truth. The headline read, "Mysterious Disappearance of Eliza Dawson, Tenant of Apartment 3B." Eliza Dawson had vanished 20 years ago without a trace. According to the article, she had lived in apartment 3B for only a few months before her disappearance. Her family had insisted she'd been happy, yet the neighbors reported hearing strange sounds coming from her apartment in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, whispers, footsteps, and an eerie melody that drifted through the walls at night. The article mentioned how authorities had found no signs of struggle, yet Eliza's belongings were left untouched, as if she'd simply vanished into thin air. Emma felt a cold dread settle over her as she read the article. She couldn't shake the feeling that Eliza's spirit was still trapped in that apartment, bound to its walls by something beyond her control. And now, somehow, Eliza had reached out to Emma, desperate for her help. The thought both terrified and intrigued her. She knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. If she wanted peace, she had to confront whatever haunted apartment 3B. That night, armed with only a flashlight and a resolve she barely felt, Emma returned to the third floor. The hallway was silent, the shadows stretched long and deep as she approached the door. She hesitated, the memory of Eliza's hollow eyes flashing in her mind. But with a deep breath, she opened the door, stepping inside the cold, empty apartment. The air felt heavier this time, thick with an almost tangible energy, as though the very walls held secrets they were aching to reveal. In the silence, the whispering returned, filling the room with a haunting melody that tugged at her soul. She closed her eyes, focusing on the sound, letting it guide her deeper into the room. And then she felt it, a presence, gentle yet pleading, as though Eliza herself was standing beside her, reaching out. Emma opened her eyes and saw a faint figure in the corner, her face pale and ghostly, her eyes filled with a sorrow that pierced Emma's heart. The woman, Eliza, mouthed a single word, her voice barely a whisper, yet filled with desperation, "Help." Emma's breath caught as she looked at the faint figure of Eliza standing before her, shimmering like a mirage. Eliza's face held a pleading expression, her hollow eyes locking onto Emma's, filled with a desperation that transcended the boundary between the living and the dead. Emma took a step forward, her voice trembling as she whispered, "How can I help you?" Eliza didn't respond with words. Instead, she turned, pointing to the far corner of the room, where a worn rug lay half rolled under a table. Emma followed her gaze, her pulse racing as she walked to the corner. The rug looked old, its fabric fraying at the edges, as though it had been left untouched for years. She hesitated, glancing back at Eliza, who gave her a solemn nod before fading slightly, her figure wavering like smoke in a breeze. Emma knelt down, gripping the edge of the rug with shaking hands. She pulled it back, revealing a small trapdoor in the floor, its wooden edges worn and scratched, as if someone had tried desperately to open it. Her heart pounded as she realized that whatever was hidden beneath had been concealed for decades. She pulled the trapdoor open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness, a cold draft seeping up from below. As she peered down, the whispers grew louder, filling the air with a haunting melody that seemed to drift up from the depths. She glanced back at Eliza, who stood at the edge of the trapdoor, her eyes filled with both fear and hope. Emma felt a surge of courage, a strange sense of duty to the lost soul before her. Taking a deep breath, she descended the stairs, each step echoing in the silence, the darkness swallowing her as she ventured deeper. The air grew colder, carrying a scent of damp earth and decay, that made her stomach twist. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a small, dimly lit room, its walls lined with old, faded wallpaper that had peeled away in patches. In the center of the room sat a single chair, and on it lay a dusty journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. She picked it up, her hands trembling as she opened it to the first page, recognizing Eliza's name scrawled in neat handwriting. The journal chronicled Eliza's last days in the apartment. Each entry was filled with desperate pleas for help, detailing how she had felt trapped, watched, and haunted by a presence she couldn't escape. The last entry was particularly chilling. "There is something in this building, something that won't let me leave. It whispers to me at night, calling my name, luring me deeper into the darkness. I don't know if I'll ever see the light again." Emma's heart ached as she read the words, realizing that Eliza had been trapped, her spirit bound to this place by forces beyond her control. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, filling the room with a chilling resonance. She looked up to find Eliza standing in the doorway, her figure more solid now, her eyes filled with a silent gratitude. Emma understood what she needed to do. She placed the journal on the chair, setting it alight with the small lighter she had in her pocket. The flames flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls as the journal burned, its pages curling and blackening as Eliza's story was finally laid to rest. As the flames died down, the room grew silent, the oppressive weight lifting as if a dark presence had finally been banished. She looked up to see Eliza smiling, her figure fading into the light, her eyes no longer hollow but filled with peace. Emma felt a tear slip down her cheek as she watched the spirit of Eliza drift away, free at last from the binds of apartment 3B. She turned and climbed back up the stairs, leaving the apartment behind, feeling a profound sense of relief. Eddie Langley had always been the dependable one, the quiet pizza delivery guy who'd become a familiar face to most of the neighborhood. After years of working the late shift, he'd grown used to the routine, the eerie quiet of empty streets, the glow of neon signs reflecting on rain-slicked pavement, and the occasional strange characters who would tip him with loose change and cryptic smiles. But the job was simple, and Eddie appreciated the predictability. One foggy night, he received an order that seemed a little off. The address was unfamiliar, deep in the outskirts of town where old Victorian houses loomed under heavy shadows and most buildings were either boarded up or decaying. Eddie double-checked the order slip, his brow furrowing. He hadn't heard of this street, but the ticket was printed clear as day, 317 Willow Lane. With a shrug, he set off, telling himself it was probably a new resident or someone renting one of the older homes on a whim. The drive was longer than he expected. Fog blanketed the road, thick and impenetrable, making it nearly impossible to see past his headlights. He found himself gripping the wheel tighter, squinting at every street sign, the eerie quiet beginning to eat away at his nerves. Finally, he spotted the street name, barely visible on a weathered signpost, and turned down a narrow lane lined with tall, twisted trees that seemed to arch over the road, casting the street into darkness. When he reached the house, he felt a chill settle over him. Number 317 stood at the end of the lane, its dark silhouette looming against the night sky. The house was massive, a sprawling old mansion with ivy crawling up its walls and windows that stared back like dark, empty eyes. No lights were on, no sign of life, but the faint glow of his car headlights illuminated the faded numbers on the front door, confirming he was at the right place. Eddie hesitated, a strange sense of dread bubbling up inside him. Reluctantly, he stepped out of the car, the pizza box in hand. His footsteps echoed on the cracked stone pathway leading up to the door. He knocked, the sound muffled by the thick, oppressive fog, and waited, glancing around the empty porch. Minutes passed, and just as he was about to turn back, he heard it, a faint rustling sound from within, like someone shuffling toward the door. He leaned closer, his heart pounding, as the door slowly creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. "Hello?" he called, his voice wavering. There was no response, only the soft sound of wind drifting through the trees. Swallowing his unease, he stepped forward, his hand hovering over the doorframe as he prepared to place the pizza down and leave. But before he could move, a cold, withered hand reached out from the darkness, grasping his wrist with an iron grip. Eddie froze, his breath hitching as he stared into the shadows, catching a glimpse of pale, hollow eyes staring back at him. The hand released him just as suddenly, leaving him gasping, stumbling backward as the door slowly closed, the heavy silence settling around him once more. He bolted back to his car, his mind racing, heart pounding, unable to shake the image of those empty, soulless eyes. As he drove away, he glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing on the porch, watching him. But the road was empty, swallowed by fog. And as he left the lane behind, He couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't truly left the house at all. Eddie couldn't shake the encounter at 317 Willow Lane. The image of those hollow eyes haunted his thoughts, lingering like a shadow in the back of his mind. By the time he returned to the pizza shop, his nerves were frayed, and he could barely hold a steady conversation with his co-workers. He hoped to push it all away, but the odd experience weighed on him, refusing to let him relax. The next night, Eddie was back on the clock, running orders as usual. Just as he thought he'd put the events of the previous night behind him, another delivery ticket popped up in the queue. His heart skipped a beat when he read the address, 317 Willow Lane. His pulse quickened as he stared at the slip, his mind racing with questions. Had someone really placed another order from that old, decaying house? He glanced around, but none of his co-workers seemed to notice anything unusual. He considered refusing the delivery, but something compelled him to accept it. Perhaps it was curiosity, or maybe a sense of duty to the job, but he found himself loading up his car and driving back down the mist-laden road. The night was just as foggy as before, and as he turned onto Willow Lane, he felt the same foreboding chill settle over him. The house loomed in the distance, shrouded in darkness, the twisted branches of trees framing it like bony fingers. Eddie parked, took a deep breath, and grabbed the pizza box. His steps felt heavier this time, each one echoing on the cracked stone path leading up to the door. He raised his fist to knock, the memory of the cold hand flashing in his mind. He hesitated, but before he could reconsider, the door creaked open, just as it had the night before. Once again, he was greeted by silence and darkness. He took a shaky step forward, his voice trembling as he called out, "Hello. Your order's here." Silence stretched out, heavy and stifling, pressing down on him like an invisible weight. Just as he was about to set the pizza down and leave, he felt the familiar icy grip latch onto his wrist. He gasped, his heart pounding, as he looked into the shadows, waiting for those hollow eyes to appear. But this time, he heard a faint whisper, so quiet he could barely make it out. "Don't leave." The voice was soft, filled with a sadness that tugged at something deep within him. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to escape the unsettling presence and never return, but a strange sense of pity crept in. Who, or what, was reaching out to him? And why? He felt a compulsion to stay, as though something unseen was drawing him in, holding him captive in its mournful gaze. Finally, the hand released him, and the door swung shut, sealing him out in the cold night once more. Eddie stood on the porch, his mind reeling, before hurrying back to his car. As he drove away, he couldn't shake the whisper from his mind, the desperate, pleading tone that seemed to cling to him. He knew he should never go back, that whatever haunted 317 Willow Lane wasn't meant for him. But as he left, he felt a strange pull, a compulsion he couldn't quite explain, as though a part of him was bound to return, whether he wanted to or not. The third time Eddie saw the address for 317 Willow Lane pop up on the delivery slip, he felt a strange mix of dread and resignation. It was as if the house had some hold on him, a pull that defied explanation, keeping him bound to that eerie lane. Every instinct screamed at him to avoid it, to tell his boss he couldn't do the delivery, but when the time came, he found himself driving down the familiar foggy road, his fingers gripping the wheel tightly as the shadows seemed to grow deeper around him. This time, he parked a bit further away, the car engine idling as he gathered the courage to approach the house. The fog was thick, swirling around him as he stepped out, giving the world an otherworldly, distorted feel. He walked up the cracked stone path, his footsteps muffled, as though the air itself were absorbing the sound. The house looked darker than ever, its windows blank and soulless, watching him with a cold indifference. As he raised his hand to knock, he felt a strange sensation, like static electricity prickling over his skin. The door opened slowly, but unlike before, the darkness inside seemed thicker, as though it were alive, pulsing with some unseen force. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the foggy windows. The silence was oppressive, pressing in on him, making it hard to breathe. This time, he decided to speak, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm here. What do you want?" The words hung in the air, swallowed by the shadows, but almost immediately, he felt that same icy grip wrap around his wrist. He forced himself not to pull away, his heart pounding as he stared into the darkness. The grip tightened slightly, and a soft voice filled the silence, a mere breath of sound. "Help me?" The plea sent a chill down his spine. He looked around, searching for any sign of the person or entity speaking to him, but there was nothing, only shadows and that chilling emptiness. Summoning his courage, he whispered back, "Who are you?" The grip on his wrist faltered, releasing him, and for a moment, he thought he saw a figure, a faint, ghostly outline in the darkness, a young woman with sorrowful eyes, staring at him with a look of utter despair. In that moment, he felt a rush of memories that weren't his own, images of the house bustling with life, laughter ringing through the rooms, only to be replaced by sorrow, an overwhelming sadness that lingered like a curse. The young woman had been trapped here, bound to the house, her soul unable to escape. The realization struck him hard. She was reaching out, desperate for freedom, clinging to any connection she could find. The images faded, leaving Eddie alone in the darkness once more. He felt a strange, aching sadness as he backed away, understanding now that she hadn't ordered the pizza to torment him, but to find help, to find someone who might release her from this place. As he turned to leave, the whisper came one last time, soft and grateful. "Thank you." He stumbled out of the house, his mind reeling, and drove away, the ghostly figure still vivid in his mind. He didn't understand the full story, but he felt certain that he'd be back one last time, this time not as a delivery driver, but as someone determined to help a lost soul find peace. Eddie couldn't rest after that night. The image of the sorrowful figure in apartment 317 haunted his dreams, her plea for help echoing in his mind. He felt an inexplicable pull, a sense of duty to return to the house, not just as a delivery driver, but as someone who might finally set her free. Gathering his courage, he took a day off work and set out in the daylight, determined to uncover the truth and help the spirit trapped within. The fog was absent this time, and the house looked almost ordinary under the pale light of day. But as he walked up the stone path, the familiar chill settled over him, a reminder that daylight offered little protection from whatever lingered inside. Taking a deep breath, he stepped through the doorway, his eyes scanning the silent, empty rooms. The air felt thick, as though the sorrow of years had seeped into the walls, anchoring the spirit within. He moved carefully through the house, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The place looked untouched, just as it had the nights before, but now he noticed small, chilling details, a faded photograph on the mantel, showing the young woman he'd glimpsed in the shadows, her eyes filled with the same sadness he'd seen before. Beside the photograph lay a small, worn notebook. He picked it up, his fingers brushing over the fragile pages, feeling a strange connection as he opened it. The notebook was filled with entries written in a delicate, shaky script. They told the story of a woman named Clara, who had once lived here, filled with hopes of starting a family, but whose life had taken a dark turn. She wrote about feeling trapped, as though the house itself held her captive, whispering dark secrets that slowly drained her of hope. The last entry was chilling, marked by desperate, frantic strokes. "I can't leave. It won't let me. I am part of it now." Eddie felt a wave of sadness wash over him as he realized the extent of her despair. Clara's spirit hadn't been able to move on, bound to the sorrow and loneliness that had consumed her. The house itself had become her prison, trapping her within its walls, her voice reaching out in the hope that someone would finally hear her plea. He placed the notebook back on the mantel, whispering into the silence, "Clara, I'm here. I'll help you find peace." As he spoke, a faint glow began to illuminate the room, a soft, warm light that filled the space with a feeling of calm. The air grew lighter, the oppressive weight lifting as a figure appeared before him, Clara's face softened by relief. She looked at him with gratitude, her eyes free of the sadness that had bound her for so long. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with a peace that brought tears to his eyes. With a final, gentle smile, her figure faded into the light, leaving the house empty and quiet. Eddie felt a sense of closure as he left, knowing that Clara had finally found freedom. As he drove away, he realized that he'd not only helped her find peace, but had also freed himself from the haunting pull of the house. He never returned to 317 Willow Lane, but the memory of that delivery, the delivery that never left, stayed with him forever. Joe Turner had been the town's go-to mechanic for as long as anyone could remember. Tucked away on the outskirts of town, his garage was a cluttered, dimly lit space filled with the scent of oil and the hum of old machines. To the townspeople, Joe was a quiet, steady presence, someone you could count on to fix a carburetor or change a tire without asking too many questions. But there was a reason Joe kept to himself, a reason why he never let anyone near the back of his garage, where a second door led down to a basement that no one in town had ever seen. It was late one autumn evening when a stranger pulled into the garage. Joe was used to late customers, travelers who'd underestimated their fuel or ignored the rattling noise under their hood. But this man was different. His car was sleek, almost too new for a town like theirs, and his suit looked expensive. The man's face was hard, his eyes sharp, as though he were seeing right through Joe. "Got a problem with the engine," he said, his voice curt. "Need it fixed tonight." Joe glanced at the clock, noting the late hour, but nodded, his instincts telling him not to turn the man away. He slid under the car, his hands moving with practiced precision as he checked for any obvious issues. But as he worked, he felt an uncomfortable prickle on the back of his neck, like he was being watched. He glanced up, catching the man staring at the back door, the one that led to the basement. Joe's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Just need a few more minutes," he muttered, returning to the engine. The man didn't respond, his gaze never leaving the door. When Joe finally finished, he stood, wiping his hands on a rag. "Should be good to go," he said, forcing a polite smile. But the man's attention had shifted, his expression unreadable as he handed Joe the cash, his fingers lingering just a second too long. "You keep this place private, don't you, Joe?" His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it, a hint of something dark. Joe's stomach twisted, but he forced a nod, watching as the man slid back into his car and disappeared into the night. The encounter left Joe shaken, his mind racing as he locked up the garage. He knew he should have forgotten about it, brushed it off as just another strange customer, but something about the man's words, the way he'd looked at the basement door, nagged at him. He'd spent years guarding that door, never letting anyone down there, never allowing himself to think about what lay below. But tonight, the memories crept back, a dark reminder of the secrets he'd buried. Unable to sleep, Joe found himself standing in the garage, staring at the basement door, his heart pounding. He hadn't opened it in years, hadn't dared to face the things he'd hidden away. But tonight felt different, like the shadows were pressing in, urging him forward. Taking a shaky breath, he unlocked the door, the creak of the hinges echoing in the silence. He stepped inside, his hand gripping the flashlight as he descended into the darkness, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was exactly as he'd left it, untouched, yet filled with a sense of dread that seemed to thicken the air. Boxes lined the walls, covered in dust, each one a reminder of a past he'd tried to forget. But as he moved deeper, the beam of his flashlight caught something new, footprints in the dust, leading to a corner where a single, worn-out box sat alone. Joe's heart skipped a beat, his mind racing with questions. Someone had been down here. And they'd found something he'd tried so hard to keep hidden. Joe's pulse quickened as he stared at the footprints in the dust. They led to a single box, one he'd buried under countless others, tucked into the darkest corner of the basement. He hadn't looked inside it in years. In fact, he'd tried to convince himself it didn't exist, that the memories tied to it were nothing more than a nightmare. But here it was, as real as the dirt under his fingernails. Taking a deep breath, he approached the box, his hands trembling as he brushed away the thick layer of dust. He could almost feel the weight of his past pressing down on him, threatening to pull him under. He opened the box slowly, his fingers tracing the edges, as though touching the memories he'd tried so hard to bury. Inside, he found a collection of old photographs, each one worn and faded, the faces frozen in time. They were images of people he'd known once, people who'd disappeared without a trace, their lives fading into the shadows just as he had hoped they would. His gaze landed on a photograph at the bottom of the box, one that sent a shiver down his spine. It was a picture of a young man, barely out of his teens, with a defiant look in his eyes. Joe remembered him well, Mark Hensley, a drifter who had blown into town one summer, full of energy and ambition. He'd come to Joe's shop once, asking for work, but Joe had turned him down. The next day, Mark had vanished, and no one had ever seen him again. The night Mark disappeared, Joe had heard strange sounds from the garage, a series of faint thuds that had echoed in the darkness. He'd brushed it off as the creaks of an old building, the shifting of tools on shelves. But now, looking at the photograph, he felt a chill run through him, as though the young man's eyes were accusing him from beyond the grave. Joe swallowed hard, the weight of guilt settling in his chest like a stone. Lost in thought, he almost didn't notice the faint sound drifting through the basement, the soft creak of footsteps, coming from somewhere above. He froze, his heart pounding as he listened, the footsteps moving closer, echoing down the stairs. Someone was in his garage. He turned off the flashlight, holding his breath as the footsteps grew louder, each one sending a jolt of fear through him. The door at the top of the stairs creaked open, and a sliver of dim light spilled into the basement. Joe pressed himself against the wall, his mind racing as he tried to think of a way out. He didn't know who was up there or why they had come, but he knew one thing for sure, they were getting closer, and there was no way out of the basement but up. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm, to stay silent. The footsteps paused at the top of the stairs, and he held his breath, the silence stretching out like a wire about to snap. He could almost feel the presence above him, a heavy, oppressive weight that seemed to fill the air. Whoever was up there, they weren't leaving anytime soon. And as Joe stood in the darkness, waiting, he realized that his secret, the one he'd kept buried all these years, was finally clawing its way to the surface, refusing to be forgotten. Joe stayed pressed against the wall, his breath shallow as he listened to the footsteps at the top of the stairs. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to find a way out, but there was nowhere to go. The dim light from the open door cast long shadows across the basement floor, and he could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him, suffocating. Whoever was up there was getting closer, and the memory of Mark Hensley's photograph burned in his mind, the young man's face frozen in time, his gaze piercing even through the years. The footsteps began to descend, slow and deliberate, each step a soft thud that sent shivers down Joe's spine. He felt trapped, cornered in the darkness, his secrets closing in on him like a noose. Just when he thought he couldn't bear the silence any longer, a voice broke through, low and cold, each word dripping with a quiet intensity that made his skin crawl. "Joe Turner. You've got some unfinished business, don't you?" He recognized the voice instantly. It was the man from the other night, the stranger in the expensive suit. Joe's heart pounded as he realized the man must have returned, drawn by some hidden knowledge, some connection to the secrets Joe had buried so long ago. But how did he know? And why was he here now, in the dead of night, picking at old wounds that Joe had fought so hard to keep hidden? Swallowing hard, Joe forced himself to speak, his voice hoarse. "Who are you, and what do you want?" His words echoed in the silence, but there was no response, only the sound of footsteps moving closer, the man's shadow stretching across the basement floor. Joe could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken accusations lurking in the darkness, and he knew that there would be no escape from this confrontation. The man's face finally emerged from the shadows, his gaze cold and unyielding, his eyes filled with a steely resolve. "You've spent years hiding, Joe. Hiding from the things you did, hiding from the people who trusted you. But secrets like yours don't stay buried forever." He took another step forward, his voice softening, almost pitying. "It's time to face the truth." Joe's mind raced, memories flooding back like a tide he couldn't hold back. Mark Hensley. The other faces in the photographs. The late-night visits from strangers who never returned. He'd convinced himself he was doing the town a service, taking care of problems no one else wanted to handle. But in that moment, standing in the darkness of his own basement, he could feel the weight of every choice, every lie, pressing down on him. The man took another step, his voice a whisper now. "Tell me, Joe. How does it feel to be haunted by your own sins?" Joe opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat, choked by the guilt and shame he'd tried so hard to bury. And as he stood there, trapped in the dark with the weight of his past bearing down on him, he realized that the stranger's visit was no accident. This was his reckoning, a chance to face the things he'd hidden, or be consumed by them. Joe's heart pounded as he stood in the shadows, face to face with the stranger who seemed to know everything. The man's piercing gaze bore into him, stripping away every lie, every excuse Joe had ever told himself. For years, Joe had justified his actions, convincing himself he'd done what needed to be done. But now, under the weight of that cold stare, he felt every choice, every deception, crushing him with a guilt he couldn't ignore. "You think you're the only one with secrets, Joe?" the man asked, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. He took a step closer, the dim light casting his face in shadow. "People like you always believe they're in control, that they can bury the past. But the past doesn't disappear, it festers, grows, and eventually, it finds a way to claw its way back." He gestured toward the dusty box, still open on the floor, the photographs spilling out, the faces of those who had vanished staring up in silent accusation. Joe's hands trembled as he glanced at the photos, his mind racing with memories he'd tried so hard to erase. He remembered every face, every voice, each one a haunting reminder of what he'd done. "I didn't mean for things to get out of hand," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. I thought I was helping. Getting rid of the troublemakers, the ones who didn't belong." The man's laugh was cold and humorless. "Is that what you told yourself?" He shook his head, his eyes filled with disdain. "You think you had the right to decide who belonged and who didn't. These people weren't just names, Joe. They had lives, dreams. And you snuffed them out like they were nothing." The words cut deep, piercing through Joe's defenses, leaving him exposed, raw with guilt and regret. Desperation clawed at Joe as he tried to explain, his voice breaking under the weight of his own lies. "It wasn't like that. I tried to help them. But some things went wrong, and I didn't know what to do. Once I started, I couldn't stop. His words felt hollow, empty even to his own ears. He could see the truth reflected in the stranger's gaze, a truth he could no longer hide from. The man's expression softened, almost as if he pitied Joe. "You don't get to run from this anymore, Joe. Those souls. They're still here, trapped by what you did, by the secrets you tried to bury in these walls. And now, they're waiting, for justice, for release. You owe them that." He stepped back, his figure fading into the darkness, his voice echoing in the silence. "They won't rest until you face them, until you make things right." As the stranger's shadow disappeared, Joe felt the room grow colder, an eerie silence filling the space. He looked around, and for the first time, he could see faint outlines, ghostly shapes moving in the dim light. The faces from the photographs materialized around him, their eyes filled with sorrow, anger, and an unspoken demand for retribution. Joe's heart pounded as he realized there was no escape, no hiding from the truth he tried so hard to bury. With a deep, shuddering breath, he knelt before the specters, his voice breaking as he whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." And as he spoke, he felt a strange warmth fill the room, the oppressive weight lifting, as though the spirits around him had finally found peace. The basement faded into darkness, and when he opened his eyes, he was alone, the secrets he'd kept no longer hidden, but released into the silence of the night. Evan had worked the night shift at Wilder's Grocers for nearly a year. It was a small, dingy store at the edge of town, where the paint was peeling and the neon "open 24 hours" sign buzzed louder than the flickering lights inside. Wilder's wasn't exactly a popular place, and that suited Evan just fine. He liked the quiet, the empty aisles, and the hum of the freezers filling the silence. But there was something about the place that felt off. Especially around midnight, when the world seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in a little closer, the lights dimming just a bit more. Evan could never quite put his finger on it, but he felt it in his bones, an unease that settled in when the clock struck 12. He'd hear strange sounds, footsteps, the faint rustle of something moving just out of sight, things he'd brush off as nothing more than his imagination. One particular night, as he was stacking cans in aisle 4, he felt that familiar chill creep down his spine. He looked up, glancing around the empty store, but nothing seemed out of place. Just the silent rows of shelves, the freezers humming in the back, and the dull glow of the overhead lights. He told himself it was just his nerves, the same late-night jitters that had been bothering him since he started. Then, he noticed something strange. At the far end of the aisle, near the storage room door, a figure stood, half hidden in the shadows. It was a tall, thin man, his features obscured by the dim light, but his eyes seemed to gleam, reflecting the faint glow of the overhead bulbs. Evan blinked, and the figure was gone, leaving only the empty aisle stretching out before him. He shook his head, muttering to himself, "Get a grip, Evan. It's just the shadows." But as he walked toward the back to check the storage room, the unease grew. The door creaked open under his hand, revealing rows of stacked boxes and shelves cluttered with supplies. Everything was in its place, but the air felt heavier, thicker, as if the darkness itself were watching him. He felt a prickle of fear, a strange sense of being out of place, as though he'd stepped into someone else's territory. Evan turned to leave, his footsteps echoing softly in the silence, but then he noticed something odd, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like a soft humming coming from the freezer room. He hesitated, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up as he strained to listen. It was a melody, low and mournful, drifting through the quiet like a memory. He shook his head, trying to brush it off, but the sound lingered, drawing him closer, pulling him back toward the freezers. And just as he was about to leave, the lights flickered, plunging the store into brief darkness. When they flickered back on, he saw it again, a flash of the figure, standing at the end of the aisle, watching him with eyes that seemed to pierce through the dim light. Evan's heart pounded, his hands shaking as he took a step back, the store suddenly feeling much smaller, much darker, as though he were trapped in a place he no longer recognized. Evan's pulse quickened as he backed away from the figure, his mind racing. He blinked, half expecting the image to disappear, but the shadowy outline remained, watching him from the end of the aisle. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to leave Wilder's grocers behind and never look back. But something about the figure held him in place, a strange, unnerving curiosity tugging at him, like he was meant to be there, like he had to know the truth. The lights flickered again, and in that split second of darkness, the figure vanished. Evan let out a shaky breath, feeling the chill finally loosen its grip on him. He glanced around, his heart pounding, but the store was empty, silent except for the faint hum of the freezers. Telling himself it was a trick of the light, he forced his legs to move, returning to his place behind the counter, hoping that the familiarity of routine would help ease his nerves. Minutes passed, then hours, and the store remained quiet. He almost convinced himself he'd imagined the figure, a product of too many late nights and too little sleep. But just as he began to relax, he heard it again, that soft, eerie humming drifting from the freezer room, like a lullaby sung in the wrong key. The sound made his skin prickle, a bone-deep dread creeping up his spine. Evan knew he should ignore it, but the melody held a strange, hypnotic pull, drawing him toward the back of the store once more. He moved slowly, his footsteps soft on the linoleum floor, his heart pounding with every step. The closer he got, the louder the humming grew, filling the silence with its haunting refrain. When he reached the freezer room door, he paused, hesitating, his hand hovering over the handle. For a moment, he thought he could hear whispers woven into the melody, like voices from another time, calling him, urging him to open the door. Swallowing his fear, he turned the handle, stepping into the cold, dark space. Rows of freezers lined the walls, their frosted glass doors hiding shadows that shifted in the dim light. The humming grew softer, more distant, as though it was slipping away, pulling him deeper into the room. Evan moved forward, his breath clouding in the cold air, his eyes scanning the freezers, searching for anything that might explain the strange sounds. At the end of the row, he noticed one freezer door slightly ajar, its cold mist drifting out like a breath in the darkness. His stomach twisted as he approached, a sense of foreboding settling over him, but he couldn't stop. Something compelled him forward, a need to understand, to see what lay within. He reached out, pulling the door open, the hinges creaking in the silence, and peered inside. There, amidst the frozen shelves, he saw something that made his blood run cold, a faint outline of a handprint pressed against the frosted glass, the fingers long and thin, like they'd been reaching out, trying to escape. Evan stumbled back, his mind racing, the humming fading into silence as he closed the door. He didn't know what he'd just seen, but he felt certain it wasn't a mistake, that someone, or something, had left that mark, trapped within the walls of Wilder's grocers, waiting in the cold for someone to finally see them. Evan backed away from the freezer, his mind reeling. The handprint on the frosted glass seemed almost alive, as if whoever, or whatever, had left it was still reaching out, trapped in a moment of desperation. He felt the urge to leave the store, to get as far away from Wilder's grocers as possible. But the pull of that handprint lingered, a morbid curiosity gnawing at him, urging him to find answers. He made his way back to the counter, trying to steady his breathing, but the image of the handprint stayed with him, flashing in his mind each time he closed his eyes. The store felt heavier, the silence pressing in around him like a weight, amplifying his every move. He thought of calling someone, maybe his friend Jake who worked the morning shift, but a strange feeling held him back. He couldn't shake the sense that this was something he had to face alone. Minutes ticked by, each one dragging out, and he forced himself to continue his shift, trying to ignore the cold that clung to him like a second skin. But just as he began to calm down, the humming returned, drifting through the aisles in a low, mournful tone. This time, it was louder, filling the store with its eerie melody, and Evan felt his pulse quicken as he followed the sound once more. He reached the end of aisle 5 when he saw it, a faint figure standing in the corner, its outline shimmering in the dim light. It was the same figure he'd seen before, tall and thin, its face obscured by shadows. Evan froze, his heart pounding as the figure turned, its hollow eyes locking onto him. A chill swept over him, the temperature dropping as the figure took a step forward, its movement slow and deliberate, as though it were struggling against an unseen force. Who are you?" Evan stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure paused, the shadows shifting around it, and for a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of sadness in its gaze. It raised a hand, pointing toward the back of the store, where the freezer room lay hidden in darkness. The humming grew louder, filling the air with a tension that felt almost suffocating, and Evan knew that the figure wanted him to go back, to face whatever was waiting in the cold. Swallowing his fear, he nodded, his steps shaky as he moved toward the freezer room. The figure remained still, watching him with those hollow eyes, its presence a silent encouragement, as though it were guiding him towards something it could no longer reach. When he reached the freezer door, he took a deep breath, steeling himself as he stepped inside, the cold air wrapping around him like a shroud. The freezer room was silent, the humming gone, but as he looked around, he noticed something new, a trail of faint footprints on the frosty floor, leading deeper into the room. His heart pounded as he followed the trail, each step taking him further into the darkness, until he reached a door he'd never noticed before, hidden behind a row of shelves. It was small and worn, its surface marked with scratches, and as he placed his hand on the handle, he felt a chill run down his spine. He knew, with a strange certainty, that whatever lay beyond this door held the answers he'd been searching for. Evan's hand trembled as he gripped the cold handle of the hidden door, a knot of fear tightening in his stomach. The eerie silence pressed in around him, amplifying his heartbeat, as he pulled the door open. Inside was a narrow staircase leading downward, each step cloaked in shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark. He hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, but the faint echo of the humming began again, pulling him forward, guiding him down the steps. The air grew colder with each step, carrying a damp, musty odor that clung to his skin. The staircase was steep and narrow, twisting downward like a dark spiral into the unknown. He kept his hand on the railing, his grip tightening as he descended, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the narrow space. When he reached the bottom, he found himself standing in a small, dimly lit room lined with shelves stacked with old, dusty cans and faded boxes, an old storage room long forgotten. The humming had faded, replaced by a heavy silence that hung in the air, thick and oppressive. He scanned the room, his eyes adjusting to the dim light, and noticed something odd, a small, wooden door tucked in the corner, almost hidden behind a stack of crates. It was painted a deep, faded red, and as he approached, he noticed scratches along the surface, as if someone had clawed at it, desperate to escape. Taking a deep breath, he reached out and pushed the door open, stepping inside a smaller, colder room. It was empty, save for a single, worn-down chair positioned in the center, and the walls were lined with crude carvings, symbols etched into the stone that seemed to pulse with a strange energy. Evan felt his skin prickle as he took in the symbols, a deep unease settling over him as if the very walls were watching him. Just as he was about to turn and leave, he heard a soft whisper, faint and distant, drifting through the silence. It was a voice, weak and trembling, as though it hadn't been heard in years. "Help me." The words sent a chill through him, his heart pounding as he spun around, searching for the source. But there was no one in sight, only the emptiness of the room, the cold pressing in on him from all sides. He took a step back, his mind racing, but as he turned to leave, he felt a hand grasp his shoulder, ice cold and unyielding. He froze, unable to breathe, the grip tightening as the whisper came again, closer this time. "Don't leave?" The voice was filled with desperation, a plea that tore at him, filling him with a sense of sorrow he couldn't explain. When he finally found the courage to turn, he saw her, a faint, ghostly figure, her face pale and filled with an unbearable sadness. Her eyes met his, and he felt the weight of her pain, her longing, as if it were his own. She reached out, her hand hovering just above his, her gaze filled with a silent plea. "Please. Help me find peace." Evan's fear melted away, replaced by a determination he couldn't ignore. He nodded, promising to do whatever it took to free her from this forgotten place. And as he spoke those words, the room seemed to lighten, the oppressive weight lifting as the ghostly figure faded, her sorrowful gaze lingering on him as she disappeared into the darkness. He stood there, alone in the silence, feeling a strange sense of closure, as though he'd finally uncovered the truth hidden within the walls of Wilder's grocers. When Mia Perkins took the night shift at St. Miriam's Hospital, she expected long hours and the eerie quiet that only a hospital at night can bring. What she didn't expect was the strange, unsettling feeling that began creeping in each night as the clock struck 3. It was subtle at first, lights flickering, the thermostat dropping suddenly, the odd feeling of being watched in the empty hallways. But as the weeks passed, the sense of unease grew, weaving itself into the very walls of the hospital. St. Miriam's wasn't a new building. It had been around for over 50 years, its walls housing thousands of patients over the decades. There were rumors among the staff of strange occurrences, of patients who claimed to see a woman in white walking through the hallways, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Mia brushed it off as superstition. After all, hospitals held enough death and sadness to stir up people's imaginations. But one night, everything changed. Mia was alone in Ward B, updating patient charts when she heard it, a faint humming, soft and mournful, drifting down the empty hall. She looked up, the sound sending a shiver down her spine. It was too soft to be from any of the patients, and the floor was empty aside from one elderly woman, who'd been asleep for hours. Mia set down her chart and stepped into the hallway, her footsteps quiet against the linoleum. The humming grew louder, filling the corridor with a haunting melody. Mia's skin prickled as she followed the sound, the empty hall stretching out before her. She turned a corner and stopped short, her breath catching in her throat. There, at the far end of the hallway, stood a woman in a nurse's uniform, her back to Mia. The woman's hair was dark, her shoulders hunched as she continued to hum, the sound echoing softly through the empty space. "Excuse me," Mia called out, her voice hesitant. The woman didn't move, didn't turn around. Mia took a cautious step forward, her heart pounding as the temperature dropped, the air growing colder with each step. She was close enough now to see that the woman's uniform was outdated, the style decades old, as though she'd stepped out of another time. Mia felt a chill run down her spine, the reality of the situation dawning on her. Just as she was about to turn and leave, the humming stopped. The woman went silent, her head tilting slightly, as though listening. Mia held her breath, frozen in place as the woman turned slowly, her face shrouded in shadow. But what Mia saw, or thought she saw, sent a jolt of terror through her. The woman's eyes were empty, hollow, staring right through her with an expression that chilled Mia to the bone. The figure vanished just as suddenly as she'd appeared, leaving Mia standing alone in the cold, empty hallway. She stumbled back, her heart racing as she tried to process what she'd seen. The clock on the wall chimed softly, marking 3 in the morning, and in that moment, Mia knew that whatever haunted Street Miriam's was more than just a story. It was real, and it was watching her. Mia couldn't shake the image of the nurse's hollow eyes. Even after her shift ended, the memory lingered, an unwelcome shadow in the back of her mind. She tried to brush it off as exhaustion, perhaps a trick of the dim hallway light. But the cold that had seeped into her bones that night felt too real to ignore. It wasn't until she returned to Street Miriam's the following evening that the true weight of what she'd seen began to settle over her. The night shift was quiet, as usual, the hospital lights dimmed, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly down the empty hallways. Mia found herself glancing over her shoulder more than once, expecting to see the dark-haired nurse standing at the end of the corridor. She reassured herself it was her mind playing tricks, her imagination running wild after too many hours in the eerie silence. But around 3 in the morning, just as she was convincing herself it had all been in her head, the humming returned. Soft, mournful, drifting through the ward with a familiar chill. Mia's heart raced as she looked up from her paperwork, her eyes scanning the dimly lit hall. There was no one in sight, but the sound grew louder, filling the empty space with its haunting melody. She knew she should ignore it, stay at her station, and let it pass. But the urge to know, to understand what haunted Street Miriam's, was too strong to resist. She stood, her footsteps cautious as she walked toward the sound, the cold air settling over her like a heavy fog. Turning a corner, she froze. There, just a few feet away, stood the nurse, her back turned, her head slightly bowed as she continued to hum, the sound echoing softly in the stillness. Mia took a step back, but the nurse's head tilted, as if sensing her presence. Slowly, the figure turned, her hollow eyes fixed on Mia with a look of quiet despair. Mia's heart pounded as she took another step back, the air thickening with an icy chill. The nurse raised a hand, pointing down the hallway, her expression blank but her eyes filled with an emotion that Mia could only describe as pleading. For a moment, Mia felt a surge of empathy, a strange connection that she couldn't explain. She took a shaky breath and nodded, stepping forward as though in a trance. The nurse turned and began walking down the corridor, her footsteps silent, her form flickering in and out of the shadows. Mia followed, the walls seeming to close in around her as she was led further down the darkened hallway. At the end of the corridor, the nurse paused before an old, unused door that Mia had never noticed before. The paint was chipped, and a faded sign above it read Ward E. Mia hesitated, her hand hovering over the handle, but the nurse's hollow eyes urged her forward, the silent plea in her gaze impossible to ignore. Taking a deep breath, Mia pushed open the door, stepping into the darkness beyond. The air beyond the door was thick and stale, carrying an unsettling chill that seemed to cling to Mia's skin. The hallway stretched out before her, shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of a flickering bulb near the ceiling. She glanced back, half expecting the nurse to follow, but the figure had vanished, leaving her alone in the eerie silence. A shiver ran down her spine as she took a cautious step forward, her footsteps echoing through the forgotten corridor. Ward E looked untouched, frozen in time. Dust clung to every surface, and old medical charts were strewn across counters, their pages yellowed with age. Mia moved slowly, her eyes scanning the room as she tried to piece together why this place had been abandoned. She spotted faded photographs on the walls, black and white images of nurses and doctors who'd worked at Street Miriam's decades ago. Her gaze lingered on one photograph in particular, a young nurse with dark hair and hollow eyes, the same expression she'd seen on the apparition. Mia's breath caught in her throat as she realized she was staring at the ghostly nurse. Her name tag read Nurse Evelyn Ward. Mia felt a strange connection to the woman in the photograph, a sense of sorrow mingling with fear as she wondered what had happened to her. She reached out, brushing her fingers over the glass, the cold seeping into her fingertips, and in that moment, a surge of emotions washed over her: fear, despair, loneliness. She pulled her hand back, her heart pounding as she stepped away. Just then, a faint rustling sound echoed from deeper within the ward. Mia's pulse quickened as she moved cautiously toward the source, drawn by a strange compulsion she couldn't explain. She entered a dimly lit room at the end of the hallway, where a single hospital bed sat beneath a dusty sheet. The air was frigid, colder than any place in the hospital, and Mia could almost feel a presence in the room, watching her from the shadows. She took a step closer, her gaze drawn to a small notebook lying on the bed, its cover faded and worn. She picked it up, flipping through the pages filled with messy, hurried handwriting. It was Nurse Evelyn's journal. Her entries grew increasingly frantic, filled with stories of strange occurrences, voices in the night, and shadows that lingered just out of sight. In her final entry, Evelyn wrote about a curse that had befallen the ward, something dark and malevolent that had attached itself to her, refusing to let her leave. Mia's hands shook as she read the last line, Evelyn's words etched in desperation: "They won't let me go. I'm trapped here. Forever." A chill ran down her spine, and she looked around, half expecting Evelyn's figure to appear beside her. But the room was empty, silent, save for the faint echo of her own breathing. As she turned to leave, the temperature dropped even further, and the door swung shut with a heavy thud. Mia's heart raced as she rushed to open it, but it wouldn't budge, trapping her in the room. Panic set in as she realized she wasn't alone. She could feel a presence closing in around her, the air thick with sorrow and fear, as if the spirits trapped in Ward E were reaching out, desperate to pull her into their world. And in that moment, Mia understood the truth: she was part of the curse now, bound to the secrets of Ward E, just like Evelyn. Mia's heart hammered in her chest as the door remained firmly shut, her fingers clawing at the handle in desperation. The shadows in the room seemed to thicken, closing in around her like a living, breathing force. She could feel the weight of the past pressing down on her, the sorrow and fear of those who had been trapped in Ward E before her, and the haunting realization that she might not make it out. The air grew colder, each breath forming a cloud as she stood frozen, her mind racing for an escape. Then, just as panic threatened to overwhelm her, the faint sound of humming filled the room. It was soft, mournful, the same tune she'd heard in the hallways before, only now it carried a deeper sorrow. Mia looked around, searching for the source, and her gaze fell upon the spectral figure of Nurse Evelyn, standing in the corner, her eyes as hollow as ever. But this time, there was a hint of sadness, an unspoken plea in her gaze as she looked at Mia. "Why? Why are you here?" Mia managed to whisper, her voice trembling. The figure of Evelyn tilted her head, her expression one of weary resignation. She reached out, her hand hovering just above the journal on the bed, and Mia understood. Evelyn wanted her to know, to understand the weight of the curse that had bound her to Ward E. Taking a deep breath, Mia opened the journal, flipping through the pages with renewed urgency. As she read, Evelyn's story came alive in her mind. She had been a dedicated nurse, compassionate and kind, but over time, she'd begun to notice strange occurrences. Patients reported seeing shadows, hearing whispers, feeling watched. She had tried to investigate, but the more she delved into the secrets of the ward, the stronger the presence grew. Soon, Evelyn had found herself unable to leave, bound by the very walls she'd once felt so familiar. Evelyn's final entry sent a chill down Mia's spine. She wrote of hearing voices, pleading with her, urging her to stay and care for them. They were lost souls, patients who had died within the ward, bound to the hospital by the pain and suffering of their final days. In her last days, Evelyn had felt herself slipping, losing her sense of self as the spirits took hold, refusing to release her even in death. As Mia closed the journal, she felt Evelyn's presence drawing closer, her cold, spectral hand resting on Mia's shoulder. "Please," Mia whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Is there a way to break this curse?" Evelyn's figure flickered, her hollow gaze softening as though she were reaching for a memory long forgotten. Slowly, she nodded, pointing to a locked cabinet in the corner of the room, hidden beneath a shroud of dust. Mia moved quickly, her hands trembling as she opened the cabinet, revealing a bundle of patient records, each one marked with a red deceased stamp. She realized then what Evelyn wanted: these souls needed acknowledgement, a voice, someone to remember their suffering. With a renewed sense of purpose, Mia gathered the records, promising Evelyn that she would do what she could to finally set them free. As she made her way back to the door, the oppressive weight lifted, and the door creaked open on its own. She turned back to see Evelyn's figure fading into the darkness, her expression one of peace for the first time. Mia stepped into the hallway, clutching the patient records, knowing she would honor their memory and finally break the curse that had held Ward E captive. And as she left, the air felt lighter, as though the spirits had finally found the release they had waited so long for. Mallory Quinn had been in real estate for nearly a decade. She knew the ins and outs of the business, from charming older clients to navigating paperwork, and there was hardly a house in the city she couldn't sell. But the Henderson property was different. Located on the outskirts of town, the house was a sprawling old Victorian, its charm dulled by years of neglect. It had sat unsold for years, a fixture of local legend more than a real piece of property. The townsfolk whispered about it, but Mallory didn't care about ghost stories. She just wanted it off her listing. The house had been through several price cuts, with almost no interest from buyers. Some said it was cursed, that strange things had happened to anyone who lived there. But Mallory wasn't superstitious. She saw the peeling paint, the cracked windows, and the overgrown yard as challenges, not warnings. Determined to finally move the property, she scheduled an open house, hoping to attract buyers with the allure of a historic fixer-upper. Arriving early on a misty Saturday morning, she stepped out of her car and took in the house's imposing figure. It loomed over the property, dark and silent, its windows like empty eyes staring out over the empty yard. Shivering, she pushed down the unease creeping up her spine and fumbled with the lockbox, her hands trembling slightly. As she stepped inside, a musty smell greeted her, a mixture of old wood and damp air that clung to everything. Mallory took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. She flipped on her flashlight and began the usual preparations, setting up her sign-in sheet, dusting off counters, and arranging her flyers. But as she moved through the rooms, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The house was silent, each step echoing through the empty space, but there was an undeniable heaviness in the air, as though the walls were holding their breath, waiting. She made her way up the creaky stairs, each step seeming to groan beneath her weight, and entered the master bedroom. The room was large, with faded wallpaper and a massive window that overlooked the tangled yard below. As she adjusted the curtains to let in more light, she caught a glimpse of something in the reflection, a shadow in the doorway, there one moment and gone the next. Mallory turned, her heart pounding, but the hallway was empty, silent. "Get a grip, Mallory," she muttered, her voice too loud in the empty room. She moved on, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. She thought she heard faint whispers, barely audible, drifting through the house like a breeze. Brushing it off as her imagination, she headed back downstairs, hoping that prospective buyers would arrive soon and fill the house with noise and life. But as she waited in the dim entryway, she realized something unnerving: her phone was dead. She'd charged it that morning, but now, nothing. The silence settled over her like a weight, and for the first time, she felt a pang of genuine fear. Standing alone in that empty house, Mallory wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was something to the stories after all. Mallory's breath caught as she stood in the empty entryway, her dead phone clutched in her hand. She glanced around, the weight of the silence pressing in on her as the old house creaked and settled. She brushed it off, telling herself it was just an old property with old problems. Still, a faint shiver ran down her spine, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was more than just a structure of wood and brick. It felt alive, watching her, waiting. After a few more minutes, the first set of potential buyers arrived, a young couple drawn in by the low price and charming history of the property. Mallory plastered on her professional smile, giving them the grand tour, but she couldn't ignore the unease gnawing at her. The couple seemed excited as they wandered through the rooms, pointing out the high ceilings and intricate molding. But when they reached the master bedroom, the young woman paused, her face growing pale as she looked around. "Are you all right?" Mallory asked, hoping her voice sounded steady. The woman hesitated, glancing at her fiancé before speaking. "It's just... this room feels strange. Like someone's still here." Her words sent a chill through Mallory, but she forced a laugh, brushing it off as the ambience of an old house. The tour continued, and Mallory noticed that every prospective buyer seemed drawn to the same spot, the large window in the living room that faced the yard. Without fail, each person would stop, staring through the glass as if transfixed, their expressions tense and uneasy. When she finally escorted the last visitor out, she couldn't help but feel relieved, eager to be rid of the lingering tension in the house. But as she walked back inside, the air grew colder, the sunlight filtering through the windows dimming as clouds gathered overhead. She made her way to the living room, her footsteps echoing in the empty space, and found herself standing before the large window, just as her visitors had. She peered outside, expecting nothing but the tangled yard, but then her eyes caught movement, a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the fading light. It was a woman, dressed in a pale, tattered dress, her figure swaying as though caught in a breeze. Mallory squinted, trying to make out the details, but just as she did, the figure seemed to melt into the shadows, disappearing among the trees. She backed away from the window, her heart pounding, unable to shake the feeling that she'd just seen something, or someone, from another time. The house creaked, settling around her, and Mallory felt a chill run through her. She told herself it was nothing, just her imagination getting the best of her. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. Something, or someone, was lingering in that house, watching from the shadows, and it was clear to her now that she wasn't alone. She needed answers. She had to find out what had happened in that house, and why the past refused to stay buried. Determined to uncover the truth, Mallory dove into research over the next few days, poring over old newspaper clippings and archives at the local library. She learned that the house had been built in the early 1900s by a man named Edward Carver, a wealthy banker who'd moved to the area with his young wife, Lillian. The couple had lived there happily, at first. But after a series of mysterious illnesses and tragedies, Lillian's mental state had deteriorated, and eventually, she disappeared under circumstances that, to Mallory, felt shrouded in mystery. Neighbors had reported strange occurrences in the house soon after Lillian vanished, whispers heard late at night, shadows moving through empty rooms, and a chilling apparition seen wandering the grounds. As she pieced the story together, Mallory realized that the woman she'd seen standing at the edge of the tree line matched the description of Lillian Carver. A shiver ran through her as she imagined Lillian's ghost wandering the property, searching for something, or perhaps someone, lost to her forever. Unable to resist, Mallory returned to the house late one evening, hoping that solitude and silence would somehow reveal the truth. The air was thick as she unlocked the door and stepped inside, the familiar musty scent greeting her. She wandered through the rooms, her footsteps soft, each creak and groan of the house amplified by the quiet. As she reached the living room, she found herself drawn once more to the large window, her eyes scanning the darkened yard. The night was still, but as she gazed out, she caught a glimpse of something pale moving through the trees. Her pulse quickened as she saw the figure again, Lillian, standing just beyond the edge of the yard, her face shrouded in shadow. But this time, there was something different. Lillian seemed closer, her outline sharper, her sorrowful eyes fixed directly on Mallory. Mallory swallowed hard, feeling an inexplicable sadness wash over her, as if she were sharing in the grief that bound Lillian to the house. The room grew colder, and she heard a faint whisper, soft and mournful, drifting through the silence. "Help me?" The words were barely audible, but they sent a chill down Mallory's spine. She wanted to turn, to leave the house, but she felt rooted in place, as if Lillian's presence was holding her there, urging her to listen, to understand. A sense of helplessness washed over her as the whispers continued, filling the room with their ghostly plea. Driven by a strange sense of duty, Mallory called out, her voice trembling. "What happened to you, Lillian?" Her words hung in the air, swallowed by the silence, but then, as if in response, the lights flickered, casting long shadows across the room. The air grew thick, and Mallory felt a pressure in her chest, a weight that seemed to seep from the walls, as though the house itself were alive with Lillian's grief. Suddenly, she heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, moving down the hall. She turned, her heart pounding as she saw the outline of a woman standing just inside the doorway, her figure faint but unmistakable. Lillian's expression was filled with sorrow, her eyes hollow as she looked at Mallory with an intensity that seemed to bridge the gap between life and death. In that moment, Mallory understood, Lillian was trapped, bound to the house by a tragedy that refused to let her go. Mallory's heart raced as she stood face to face with the faint figure of Lillian Carver. The ghost's hollow eyes seemed to plead with her, pulling her into the sorrow that bound her spirit to the house. The air felt heavy, thick with an unspoken grief that seeped from the walls, pressing down on Mallory with a weight that was both invisible and undeniable. She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to stay calm as she met Lillian's gaze. "What happened to you, Lillian?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the cold silence. The ghostly figure didn't move, but Mallory sensed a shift in the air, as though the spirit were trying to convey something, a story trapped in the silence, desperate to be heard. A faint chill brushed against Mallory's arm, and she felt a strange compulsion to follow, as if Lillian were guiding her deeper into the house, pulling her toward the truth. Mallory moved slowly, her footsteps quiet as she followed an invisible path through the dimly lit rooms. She found herself drawn up the staircase to the master bedroom, the same room where she had first seen the shadow in the mirror. As she stepped inside, the air grew colder, and a soft, mournful whisper drifted through the room. She looked around, her eyes scanning the faded wallpaper, the dusty furniture, until her gaze fell on a small, ornate jewelry box sitting on the dresser. She walked over and opened the box, her fingers brushing against an old, faded photograph tucked beneath a layer of tarnished jewelry. She pulled it out, her heart sinking as she recognized the young, beautiful woman in the picture, Lillian Carver, standing beside her husband, Edward. They looked happy, their smiles genuine, but Mallory noticed something unsettling in Edward's gaze, a darkness that seemed to contradict the warmth in Lillian's expression. Suddenly, the room grew colder, and Mallory felt a presence behind her, a faint pressure that made her heart race. She turned, half expecting to see Lillian, but instead, the shadows in the room seemed to deepen, taking on the vague outline of a tall, imposing figure. A chill ran down her spine as she realized it was Edward. His presence felt different from Lillian's, a darkness that seemed to cling to him, thick and oppressive. As she stood there, the truth began to unfold in her mind. Edward hadn't been the loving husband he appeared to be. Lillian's disappearance hadn't been an accident. Mallory could almost feel the pain, the betrayal that had bound Lillian to the house, her spirit trapped by the darkness that had once controlled her life. She understood now that Lillian's ghost had been trying to reveal the truth, to break free from the grip that Edward's spirit still held over her. Taking a deep breath, Mallory whispered, "Lillian, I understand. You're free now." The room seemed to lighten, the oppressive weight lifting as a soft warmth filled the air. She felt a faint touch on her hand, a gentle, grateful presence, and in that moment, she knew Lillian had found peace. The shadows faded, the room growing still, and as Mallory stepped back, she felt a sense of closure, knowing that the curse binding the house had finally been broken. Amy had worked the night shift at Brood Awakening for 2 years. It was a small, cozy coffee shop nestled on a quiet corner of Main Street. Most nights were slow, filled with the familiar hum of the espresso machine, the soft clinking of mugs, and the rare, tired patron wandering in for a late-night caffeine fix. But there was something about tonight that felt different. It was her last shift, a fact that brought a strange mixture of relief and unease she couldn't quite place. As the clock struck midnight, the street outside was unusually quiet. No footsteps, no cars rolling by, just an eerie stillness that seemed to press against the glass windows. Amy tried to ignore it, focusing on cleaning the counters and restocking supplies, but the silence was oppressive, settling over the shop like a blanket. She glanced around, her gaze lingering on the shadows in the corners, half expecting to see something lurking just out of sight. Around 12:30, the bell above the door chimed, breaking the silence. Amy looked up, surprised to see a man standing in the doorway. He was tall, with a thin frame and sharp features that seemed exaggerated in the dim light. His clothes were slightly outdated, a dark trench coat hanging loosely over his shoulders. He met her gaze with a piercing intensity, his eyes cold and unblinking as he stepped inside. "Just a black coffee, please," he said, his voice low and almost mechanical. Amy nodded, moving to the coffee machine, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The man's presence was unsettling, his gaze never leaving her as she worked. She glanced at the clock, 12:33. Time seemed to crawl, each second stretching out as she poured his coffee and handed it over, her hand brushing his cold, dry fingers for a split second. He took a seat in the corner, sipping his coffee in silence, his eyes fixed on the street outside. Amy busied herself with closing tasks, trying to ignore him, but every time she looked up, his gaze was still there, following her every movement. As the minutes passed, the silence in the shop grew heavier, almost tangible, as if the air itself had thickened. She felt trapped, each sound amplified against the backdrop of quiet. Then, at exactly 12:45, he stood up, placed his empty cup on the counter, and walked out without a word. The bell chimed, echoing in the silence, and Amy felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. She glanced at the empty cup, noticing something strange, a thin, dark ring encircling the bottom, as though the coffee had left an unnatural stain. She wiped it clean, but the mark wouldn't fade, a dark reminder of the man's presence. As she finished her shift, locking up the shop, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that the coffee shop she'd known so well held secrets she was only beginning to uncover. And as she walked out into the quiet night, the strange, dark ring on the counter lingered in her mind, a silent omen that her last shift was far from over. Amy returned to Brood Awakening the following night, unable to ignore the unsettling experience from her final shift. She'd handed in her notice, packed her things, and told herself she was done with the place. But something about that strange customer, the ring he left on the counter, nagged at her. She felt as though she'd walked out on a puzzle she was meant to solve. Inside, the coffee shop felt unchanged, yet somehow wrong. The familiar smell of espresso and pastries seemed overpowered by an earthy, cold scent she hadn't noticed before. She ran her fingers over the spot where the man's cup had left the dark ring, half expecting it to be gone. But there it was, a faint shadow on the counter, as if the coffee itself had left a stain of something more sinister. Amy glanced at the clock, 12:30. The street outside was empty, the dim glow of street lamps casting long shadows on the pavement. She stood behind the counter, her eyes fixed on the door, waiting. And at exactly 12:33, the bell above the door chimed. Her stomach clenched as the same man stepped inside, his face expressionless, his gaze intense as he walked toward her. "Just a black coffee," he murmured, his voice carrying that same cold, mechanical tone. She poured his coffee, her hands shaking slightly, and handed it over, feeling his icy fingers brush hers once again. He took a seat in the corner, just like the night before, and stared out the window, sipping his coffee in silence. Amy watched him from the counter, her curiosity warring with an instinctive fear. She wanted to ask him who he was, why he'd come back. But something held her back, a feeling that the less she knew, the safer she'd be. The minutes ticked by, each one dragging out as she waited. Then, just like before, he rose at exactly 12:45, leaving his empty cup on the counter and walking out without a word. Amy's gaze fell to the cup, her heart pounding as she saw the same dark ring etched into the counter. She wiped at it again, scrubbing harder, but the stain wouldn't budge. It felt permanent, like a mark branded into the shop itself, a lingering reminder of his visits. Unease prickled at her, and she decided to confront her manager the next day, asking if he knew anything about the man. But when she brought it up, he brushed her off, claiming he hadn't seen anyone strange in the shop and that the coffee was the same as it had always been. "Just stress," he told her. "The night shift can play tricks on you." But Amy knew it wasn't just her imagination. The strange man had left something behind, a darkness that seemed to seep into the very bones of the coffee shop. And as she left that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that somewhere in the shadows, the man was waiting, biding his time, his cold eyes fixed on her every move. Amy's mind buzzed with questions, her nerves frayed as she returned to Brood Awakening the next night, determined to uncover the truth behind the mysterious man's visits. She'd spent the day restless, her thoughts circling back to that dark ring left on the counter, an imprint she felt certain held some significance. She told herself that tonight, she'd confront the man if he showed up again. She needed answers. As midnight approached, the street outside grew unnervingly quiet. The coffee shop felt colder than usual, the air thick with an energy that made her skin prickle. Amy glanced at the clock, 12:30. She busied herself with cleaning the machines, her gaze darting toward the door every few seconds, waiting. At exactly 12:33, the bell chimed, and the man entered, his expression as blank as ever. "Black coffee, please," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the silence. She poured the coffee, her hands steadier this time, and handed it over. But instead of retreating to his usual spot, the man stood by the counter, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that made her stomach twist. Summoning her courage, she spoke up. "Why do you keep coming back? What do you want?" The man's gaze held hers, and for a moment, she saw something flicker in his eyes, a hint of sadness perhaps, or something darker. "I have no choice," he murmured, his tone softer now, almost resigned. "This place. It's where I ended. Where I linger." He lifted his coffee cup, taking a slow sip, his gaze drifting to the window as though caught in a memory. Amy's heart pounded, her mind racing. "Ended?" she echoed, her voice barely a whisper. She wanted to press him for more, but something in his demeanor warned her not to push too hard. I don't understand," she said, her words trembling. But he offered no further explanation, simply finishing his coffee in silence before setting the cup down, leaving the same dark ring on the counter. He walked to the door, pausing for a moment. "Remember me?" he whispered, his voice barely audible, as though speaking from a place far removed from the present. And then he was gone, the bell's chime fading into the stillness, leaving Amy alone with her racing thoughts. She looked down at the ring on the counter, her fingers brushing over it, and felt a chill as she realized the stain was now etched deeper, darker, as if the man had left a piece of himself behind. After that night, Amy started digging, searching for any clue about the man's identity. She combed through old records and town archives, poring over articles and records. And then, buried in an old newspaper, she found it, an article from years ago about a man who died under mysterious circumstances right outside Brood Awakening. The man in the article matched the description of her visitor exactly, his name lost to time but his story bound to the place he left behind. The weight of his words settled over her. "Remember me?" She understood now. The man was trapped, caught in an endless loop, drawn back to the place where his life had ended. And as Amy stared at the dark ring on the counter, she felt a chill of realization. She was the only one who could see him, the only one who could bear witness to his silent plea. Amy's hands shook as she closed the newspaper, her mind swirling with the revelation. The man she'd seen, the one who kept returning each night, had died right outside the coffee shop years ago. Yet here he was, visiting her in some strange, twisted ritual, forever tied to the place that had marked the end of his life. She had thought her last shift was behind her, but she now felt an obligation, a pull to return once more. That night, Amy walked into Brood Awakening with a sense of purpose. The dim glow of the street lamp outside cast a pale light through the shop's windows, illuminating the dark ring on the counter, now a permanent stain. The clock ticked toward midnight, the air thick with anticipation. She took a deep breath, knowing this might be her last encounter with the man's ghost, and her only chance to bring him peace. At exactly 12:33, the bell above the door chimed. The man stepped inside, his movements slower, almost weary, as if the weight of his endless visits had finally taken a toll. He approached the counter, meeting her gaze with a familiar intensity, his eyes holding a plea she could no longer ignore. "Black coffee, please," he murmured, his voice softer than before, tinged with a sadness that made her chest ache. This time, Amy didn't ask questions or press him for answers. She poured his coffee, the silence stretching out between them, each second filled with an unspoken understanding. He took the cup, holding it for a moment before speaking. "You're the only one who sees me. The only one who remembers?" His voice was faint, almost fragile, as though he were on the verge of fading away. Amy felt a lump form in her throat as she looked at him. "I remember," she whispered, her words filled with a promise she hadn't fully understood until now. She reached across the counter, her hand brushing his in a gesture of comfort, a silent assurance that he was not alone. His gaze softened, the sadness in his eyes lifting, and for the first time, she saw a hint of peace in his expression. As the clock struck 12:45, he placed the cup on the counter, the dark ring now a permanent mark, a reminder of his visits. He turned to leave, but paused at the door, casting one last look back at her. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice a mere echo. And then he was gone, the bell's chime fading into the silence, leaving the coffee shop empty and still. Amy stood alone, a strange sense of closure settling over her. The dark ring remained on the counter, a mark she knew would never fade, but the air felt lighter, as though the weight of the man's spirit had lifted. She locked up the shop, her steps slow and steady as she walked out into the quiet night, knowing that she had helped him find peace, and that her final shift had, at last, come to an end. Stan Lowell had been the local mailman in Brimfield for as long as he could remember. Each day, he'd weave through the quiet neighborhoods, waving at familiar faces, leaving envelopes and packages on doorsteps. The people in town trusted him, and he liked the feeling that he was a part of their lives in his quiet, reliable way. But there was one road on his route that gave him the creeps, a long, winding street on the outskirts of town called Cedar Hollow Road. Cedar Hollow wasn't like the other streets in Brimfield. Its houses were set far apart, nestled among thick trees that cast long shadows even on the sunniest days. The street was always silent, almost eerily so, with not a single car passing by during his daily route. The residents, too, were strange, aloof, always watching him from their windows but never stepping outside to greet him. Stan couldn't remember the last time he'd actually spoken to one of them, and it was as if they preferred it that way. One day, Stan was sorting his deliveries when he noticed a peculiar envelope addressed to the occupant of Cedar Hollow. There was no name, just a scrawled handwriting, and a return address that looked faded, as if it had been written years ago. The envelope felt heavy in his hands, the paper thick and worn. Something about it didn't sit right with him, but he shrugged it off, chalking it up to a minor curiosity, and added it to his bag. As he made his way down Cedar Hollow, he felt the familiar unease creeping up his spine. The shadows under the trees seemed darker than usual, the air thick with a silence that felt too deep, too unnatural. He stopped at the first mailbox, a rusty old thing that looked like it hadn't been opened in years, and slipped the envelope inside. As he moved to the next house, he thought he caught a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye, a figure standing behind a tree, watching him. Stan froze, his heart pounding as he squinted into the shadows, but the figure was gone, leaving only the rustle of leaves in the faint breeze. He shook his head, telling himself it was just his imagination. But as he continued down the road, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck that made every hair stand on end. The houses seemed to loom over him, their windows like eyes following his every move. When he reached the last house on the road, he noticed something strange. The mailbox was gone, replaced by a small wooden box perched on the porch steps. Curiosity got the better of him, and he walked up the creaking steps to drop the envelope inside. Just as he was about to turn and leave, the door creaked open a fraction, revealing an eye peering through the gap, a cold, piercing gaze that held him in place. Stan took a shaky step back, mumbling an apology, but the door closed just as silently as it had opened. His heart pounded as he hurried back to his truck, the shadows of Cedar Hollow Road pressing in around him. As he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd left more than just an envelope behind, that, somehow, the street had marked him, drawn him into its silent, watchful gaze. Stan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The whole night after his unsettling route through Cedar Hollow, his dreams were filled with images of that single, watching eye behind the door, and the shadowy figure lurking behind the trees. When he woke up, he was drenched in sweat, the lingering dread clinging to him like a second skin. He tried to tell himself it was just his imagination, the effect of too many eerie shadows and his overactive mind. But the sense of unease stayed with him, gnawing at him like a persistent itch. The next day, Stan approached Cedar Hollow with a sense of trepidation. He went through his route as usual, delivering mail and exchanging greetings with familiar faces, but his thoughts kept drifting to the road on the outskirts of town. When he finally arrived at Cedar Hollow, he noticed something strange. The envelope he'd delivered the day before was back in his bag. It was the same faded paper, the same scrawled handwriting, addressed again to the occupant of Cedar Hollow. He stared at it, his skin prickling. How had it ended up back in his possession? Trying to brush off the discomfort, he slid the envelope into the first mailbox. But as he continued down the street, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. This time, he could hear faint whispers, murmurs drifting through the trees, too low to make out, like voices just out of reach. Stan's heart hammered in his chest as he forced himself to move from house to house, slipping the envelope into a new mailbox each time. When he reached the last house, the same wooden box was still on the porch steps. He hesitated, the memory of that single eye watching him vivid in his mind, but he approached it anyway, the envelope in hand. He slipped it inside, half expecting the door to open, but this time, nothing happened. He let out a shaky breath, relief washing over him as he turned to leave. But as he walked back to his truck, he caught sight of something that made his blood run cold, a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, watching him. The figure was tall and thin, its face hidden in shadow, but he could feel its gaze, intense and unwavering. He froze, his heart pounding, and for a moment, they stood in silence, staring at each other through the distance. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving only the rustle of leaves in its wake. Stan stumbled back to his truck, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. He knew he should tell someone, report the strange occurrences on Cedar Hollow, but he couldn't bring himself to speak of it. The residents there were secretive, distant, and somehow, he felt certain they wouldn't take kindly to his intrusion. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure watching him from the shadows. But the road was empty, silent, as though Cedar Hollow had swallowed the darkness back into itself, leaving only the faint echo of whispers in the air. Stan couldn't escape the feeling that Cedar Hollow was pulling him into something dark and unexplainable. For the next few days, he managed his route cautiously, hoping he could go through Cedar Hollow quickly and without incident. But each time he approached the street, the same heavy, silent atmosphere pressed down on him, and each time, he found himself carrying that same strange envelope, as if the road itself was refusing to accept the delivery. One evening, Stan decided he'd had enough. He planned to drop the envelope at the first house on Cedar Hollow and leave it behind for good. As he turned onto the road, the familiar shadows seemed darker, thicker, stretching out toward him as though they were alive. His headlights flickered briefly, casting eerie beams through the trees, illuminating glimpses of figures lurking just beyond the edge of his vision. He couldn't shake the feeling that the entire street was watching him. He reached the first house and slipped the envelope into the mailbox, glancing around nervously. As he closed the mailbox door, he heard a faint sound behind him, a soft whisper that sent a chill down his spine. Stan turned, but the street was empty, silent, save for the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. He hurried back to his truck, his pulse racing, eager to get off Cedar Hollow once and for all. But as he pulled away, his heart sank. The envelope was back in his bag, resting on top of the other mail as if it had never left. He stared at it, his hands trembling, a knot of fear tightening in his stomach. He knew he hadn't imagined it. He'd placed the envelope in the mailbox himself. But somehow, it had found its way back to him, as if Cedar Hollow itself wouldn't let him leave without it. Determined to end the strange occurrences, Stan decided he'd try delivering it to the last house, the one with the wooden box on the steps. As he approached, he noticed a dim light in one of the upstairs windows, flickering like a candle. He parked his truck, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on him as he climbed the steps. The wooden box sat there, waiting, its dark wood seeming to absorb the light around it. He placed the envelope in the box, hesitating for a moment, his gaze drawn to the door. He felt the same oppressive gaze he'd sensed before, as though someone were watching him from just beyond the door, waiting for him to leave. He took a step back, his heart pounding, and turned to leave. But as he reached his truck, he heard a faint, haunting whisper carried on the wind, "You cannot leave." Stan froze, dread washing over him. He turned back, his eyes scanning the shadows, but the street was empty, the houses dark and silent. He hurried to his truck, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel, the whisper echoing in his mind. And as he pulled away from Cedar Hollow, he knew, deep down, that whatever lived on that street had no intention of letting him escape its hold. The following night, Stan found himself lying awake, his thoughts tangled in the mystery of Cedar Hollow. The haunting whisper, the eerie figure lurking at the edge of the trees, and the envelope that wouldn't leave his mailbag had shaken him to his core. He was afraid, yet something drew him back to that darkened street. It was as if Cedar Hollow itself had reached out, latching onto him, pulling him back, and refusing to let him go. By midnight, he couldn't resist any longer. Throwing on his coat, he drove to Cedar Hollow, his headlights slicing through the thick fog that had settled over the road. The houses loomed in silence, their dark windows staring back at him like empty eyes. He parked his truck at the entrance to the street, deciding to walk the length of Cedar Hollow. He needed answers, needed to know why this place had targeted him, what it wanted from him. As he walked, the whispers began, faint at first, like distant murmurs carried on the wind. But with each step, they grew louder, filling the air with fragmented voices that seemed to come from every direction. "Help us," they whispered, "remember us?" The words sent chills through him, and he could feel the weight of countless unseen eyes watching, waiting. When he reached the last house, the one with the wooden box, he felt an overwhelming pull to go inside. The door stood slightly ajar, creaking as he pushed it open. The inside was dark, cold, the faint scent of damp wood and mildew filling the air. He moved through the rooms, his footsteps echoing in the silence, each creak of the floorboards amplifying the oppressive tension. In the living room, he noticed something peculiar, a wall lined with photographs, each one faded, yellowed with age. They were pictures of families, couples, individuals, each one smiling, seemingly happy. But as he looked closer, Stan noticed something chilling. Each person in the photos was familiar, they were all people he'd delivered mail to over the years, residents of Cedar Hollow who had mysteriously disappeared without a trace. A creeping horror settled over him as he realized the truth. Cedar Hollow wasn't just a street, it was a trap, a place that drew people in, making them vanish, leaving nothing but memories behind. And as he stared at the photographs, he saw a space left blank at the end of the row, a space that seemed to be waiting, reserved for someone else. For him. Stan stumbled back, his heart racing as the whispers grew louder, filling the room with a desperate, pleading chorus. "Don't leave us. You're one of us now." He turned and fled, his footsteps pounding as he ran from the house, the whispers following him, urging him to stay. He burst out onto the street, gasping for breath, feeling the weight of Cedar Hollow pressing in, trying to pull him back. He reached his truck, hands shaking as he fumbled with the keys, but as he looked up, he saw the figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching him with hollow, empty eyes. And in that moment, Stan understood, Cedar Hollow would never let him go. The street had claimed him, just as it had claimed all the others before him, trapping them in its shadows, binding them to its secrets forever. Ellie Tanner had worked as the head librarian at Wilford Library for 15 years. She loved the quiet of the stacks, the comforting smell of old paper, and the soft hum of fluorescent lights that kept the sprawling library lit well into the evening. But there was one thing she could never quite understand: a book that refused to stay shelved. No matter how many times she put it back, the lost guide always found its way back to her desk the next morning, as if it were waiting for her. At first, she thought it was a prank. Maybe one of the other librarians was playing a joke, or perhaps one of the night shift janitors was having some fun. She mentioned it to Harry, the library's assistant, but he just shrugged, brushing it off as one of the quirks of an old building. "Maybe the book's just trying to tell you something," he joked, his tone light-hearted. But Ellie couldn't shake the sense that there was something odd about the book. The cover was plain, a faded blue with a barely visible title etched along the spine. There was no author's name, no publisher's mark, and no barcode. The pages felt different too, worn and almost waxy to the touch, as though they'd been handled countless times over the years. Yet, despite its age, she'd never seen anyone check it out, and she couldn't remember ever adding it to the library's collection. One night, as Ellie finished up her closing duties, she found herself drawn to the book once more. It sat on her desk, the dim light casting shadows across its cover, the title glinting faintly in the glow. She hesitated, feeling a strange compulsion to open it, as though the book itself were urging her to look inside. Taking a deep breath, she opened it, flipping through the pages slowly, each one filled with strange symbols and cryptic text that didn't seem to make sense. But the further she read, the more she felt a peculiar connection to the words, as if they were calling to her, speaking in a language just beyond her comprehension. The library around her seemed to fade, the world narrowing to the words on the page. She lost track of time, her mind caught in the strange rhythm of the text, until a soft creak behind her snapped her back to reality. She looked up, startled, but the library was empty, silent. Shaking off the strange feeling, she closed the book and placed it on the return cart, determined to leave it for the next shift to shelve. She switched off the lights and locked up, but as she walked out into the cool night air, a chill ran down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that the book was somehow watching her, waiting. And as she drove home, her mind kept drifting back to those cryptic pages, the strange, haunting pull that seemed to cling to her, even as she left the library behind. When she returned the next morning, her stomach twisted as she saw the book sitting on her desk once again, as if it had been waiting for her all along. She stared at it, a feeling of dread settling over her, realizing that whatever mysteries the book held, it wasn't going to let her go until she uncovered its secrets. Ellie couldn't ignore the book's presence anymore. Each morning, without fail, the lost guide would appear on her desk, no matter where she tried to hide it. She shelved it in the basement, slipped it among old periodicals, even locked it in her drawer one night, but every time she returned to the library, the book was there, waiting. The silent persistence began to eat away at her, and she found herself increasingly anxious, almost jumpy, around her once beloved library. One evening, as she was finishing up her shift, she finally gave in to the urge to open it again. The library was empty, its familiar quiet stretching around her like a thick, invisible cloak. She sat down at her desk, the book's worn cover cold under her fingertips. She opened it to the first page, squinting at the faint, faded letters that spelled out something incomprehensible, almost as if it were written in a language she'd once known, but had long since forgotten. As she read, the room seemed to shift, the light dimming, her surroundings growing hazy at the edges. The words on the page were clearer tonight, more coherent, and she could make out phrases that spoke of ancient rites, forgotten places, and lost souls wandering in search of their memories. A chill prickled at her skin, and she forced herself to look away, grounding herself in the library's familiar setting, her heartbeat slowing as the world returned to normal. But the words clung to her, each sentence creeping into her mind, weaving itself into her thoughts until she could feel them pulsing behind her eyelids. She shut the book with a trembling hand, placing it on her desk, but just as she turned to leave, she heard a faint rustling sound from the stacks. It was quiet at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, echoing in the silent library like whispers drifting through the aisles. "Harry!" she called out, her voice shaky. She knew Harry had gone home hours ago, but the thought of being alone in the library was worse than anything else. The rustling stopped, replaced by a thick silence that pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. She moved toward the sound, her footsteps slow and hesitant, the faint glow from her desk lamp casting long, eerie shadows between the shelves. As she rounded the corner, she saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the aisle, shrouded in shadows, barely visible in the dim light. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure turned slightly, its gaze fixed on her, a hollow emptiness in its eyes that seemed to reach into her soul. She stumbled back, her heart pounding as she watched the figure dissolve into the darkness, leaving only the lingering sense that she was not alone. Ellie fled back to her desk, her hands shaking as she locked up the library. But even as she left, she could feel the book's weight in her bag, its presence clinging to her, a silent reminder of the secrets waiting to be uncovered. She knew that whatever lurked within the lost guide, it wasn't going to rest until she found the answers it demanded, even if it meant facing the darkness that now seemed woven into the very fabric of her library. Ellie could hardly sleep that night, the image of the hollow-eyed figure haunting her whenever she closed her eyes. She lay awake, the book's cryptic phrases swirling in her mind, each line feeling like a thread pulling her deeper into a dark, tangled web. By morning, she was exhausted, but a strange compulsion pushed her back to the library, a quiet yet relentless urge to return to the lost guide. She felt as if the book held a part of her now, and leaving it unread was impossible. When she arrived, Harry greeted her with a concerned look. "Ellie, you look like you haven't slept," he said, frowning. "Are you sure everything's all right?" She forced a smile, nodding. "Just had a rough night, that's all," she replied, her voice shaky. She didn't dare mention the book, she doubted anyone would believe her, let alone understand the pull it had over her. Harry's gaze lingered on her for a moment, but he eventually shrugged, letting her get back to work. As she sat at her desk, she noticed the book waiting for her once again, its faded blue cover looking worn yet strangely timeless. She opened it, flipping through pages filled with unfamiliar symbols and text that seemed to shimmer slightly under the light. This time, the words were sharper, the language more understandable, as if the book itself were guiding her. The pages spoke of a hidden library, a place where knowledge was bound by shadows, secrets protected by unseen forces. The descriptions were vivid, conjuring images of winding corridors filled with rows of ancient books, each one holding the memories of souls long forgotten. She could almost feel the cold, damp air, smell the faint mustiness of paper and dust, as if she were standing in that hidden place herself. Her pulse quickened, and she lost herself in the words, the library around her fading as she was pulled deeper into the book's strange, dark world. Then, suddenly, she heard the rustling again. Louder this time, echoing through the library like a chorus of whispers. She looked up, her gaze darting through the stacks, half expecting to see the figure from the night before. But instead, she saw movement, a flicker of something dark slipping between the shelves, just out of reach. She stood, her heart racing as she followed the sound, her steps slow and cautious. The whispering grew louder, almost beckoning her, and as she rounded a corner, she saw it again, a shadowy figure standing near the back of the library. Its face was obscured, its form shifting as though it were caught between this world and another. Ellie's throat tightened, her body frozen as the figure raised a hand, pointing to a section of books on the shelf beside it. She looked closer, squinting through the dim light, and noticed a small gap in the row of books, a space where the lost guide seemed to fit perfectly. Trembling, Ellie returned to her desk, clutching the book as she walked back to the shelf. She placed it in the empty space, feeling a strange sense of finality as the book slid into place. The whispers quieted, the shadowy figure dissolving into the air, leaving behind a silence that felt both comforting and unnerving. She stepped back, relief washing over her as she realized the book had returned to where it belonged. But as she turned to leave, a chill ran down her spine, a faint whisper drifting through the silence, "Find us. Remember us?" Ellie tried to push the eerie events out of her mind, but the final whisper, "Find us. Remember us," echoed in her thoughts, refusing to let go. She hoped that shelving the lost guide in its rightful place would end whatever strange connection she'd formed with the book. But over the next few nights, her dreams became tangled with images of that hidden library, a place filled with darkened halls and shadowed alcoves, where secrets whispered from every shelf. One night, the dream felt so vivid that Ellie woke with a start, her heart pounding. She glanced at the clock, 2:45 a.m., and couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was waiting for her at the library. She knew it was irrational, but the pull was too strong to ignore. Grabbing her keys, she drove through the quiet streets, her headlights cutting through the fog as she made her way to the darkened library. Inside, the library was silent, almost unnaturally so. She walked through the dimly lit aisles, her footsteps echoing softly, her skin prickling with a familiar unease. She found herself heading toward the section where she had shelved the lost guide, her pulse quickening with each step. When she reached the shelf, her heart sank, the book was gone, the space where it had been now empty. As she stood there, a soft creak echoed from behind her. She turned, squinting into the darkness, and saw a faint light emanating from the basement stairwell, a place few dared to go. Driven by a mixture of fear and curiosity, Ellie descended the stairs, the air growing colder with each step, the silence thickening. The basement was dimly lit, rows of shelves casting long shadows across the floor. And there, at the far end, sat the lost guide, placed on a small, isolated table as if it were waiting for her. She approached the book, her hands trembling as she opened it once more. The pages were different now, clearer, the language fully understandable. It was a story, one she hadn't seen before, detailing the lives of those who'd been lost, each name carefully recorded with haunting descriptions of how they'd been drawn into the book's mysteries. The last page was blank, save for a line scrawled in faint, trembling handwriting, "Remember us, or be forgotten." The basement felt colder, the shadows pressing in around her as she read the words. She looked up, and her breath caught as she saw shadowy figures standing between the shelves, their hollow eyes watching her, each one silent, waiting. They were familiar faces, residents from town, past patrons of the library, people she'd assumed had moved on or left long ago. She felt a wave of realization wash over her. These were the souls who'd been claimed by the lost guide, bound to its pages, lost to time. Summoning her courage, Ellie spoke softly. "I remember you. I'll make sure you're not forgotten." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, the figures seemed to soften, their hollow gazes filled with a flicker of relief. One by one, they faded into the shadows, their presence lifting as though a weight had been released from the air. As Ellie turned to leave, she noticed the book now resting closed on the table, its cover worn and faded. She understood that it was finally at peace, its purpose fulfilled. And as she ascended the stairs, the library felt warmer, lighter, as though the souls it had harbored had finally been set free. Thank you for listening. Be sure to check out our channel for more stories.